The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. When evening had come, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took Jesus with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. Jesus said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The Gospel of the Lord. We live in stormy times. A lot of the turbulence is caused by, and I know you've heard me say this before, it's caused by really, really bad ideas in circulation on the minds of people and directing their actions. One really bad idea is to privilege emotion over reason, both in our personal lives, but more dangerously in the public sphere. The human soul, the mind, however you want to understand our interior lives as human beings, is roiled by emotion, particularly fear, but we have mixed up in there a lot of others. When we think about the deadly sins, these correspond to our emotional states. Anger and jealousy being the obvious examples. However, the virtues do as well have this correspondence, but they express a control over our emotions. For example, courage is a virtue that controls fear. Temperance moderates our feelings of anger and of envy. When we fail to control interior lives, a storm rages within us. If, as a society, we cease to instruct and encourage people in virtues, we soon see these little individual storms collect into hurricanes of emotionally driven destruction, as we saw last summer, as we continue to see today with acts of historical vandalism and retribution that grow out of humanity's legacy of mutual injury and abuse. The great ark that is the church is today caught in this gathering storm, and in recent months, when we were not able to gather as a community, we felt keenly our isolation, alone or in small household groups of 2, 3, 4, perhaps a few more. Each little domestic church, a modest vessel floating on the chaos of modern life. The inability to gather, to recognize that we aren't alone by seeing the physical reality of 100 or more souls gathered together to confess the faith, receive the sacraments, offer thanksgiving. Without this, over time, it can make us seem so vulnerable, give rise to the fear that we are indeed perishing and that God doesn't care. We need to remember that God is always in the boat with us. Whether it is here in this church, which you might think of as a great galley, with all of you there sitting in your rows, pulling on oars to propel us through the sea of life, or when alone, a solo sailor upon the waters, Christ is there. Yet we need to awaken him when the storm clouds gather. And when awakened, what does Christ bring? Yes, in the story, after rebuking the disciples for their lack of faith, he goes to the bow. I suppose in this version he stays on the cushion. He just, raises his arms, commands the sea and the sky to quieten and become calm. But I'd argue there is in this a powerful teaching that comes, perhaps what you'd say, through metaphor. There is a greater message here than a tale of maritime rescue. I've spoken of this before, how Christ, as God incarnate, manifests the Logos of God. When we read the opening of John's Gospel, that famous passage that describes Jesus as the Word made flesh that dwelt among us, that Greek word is translated from logos, which is something greater than merely a written word or sign. That Greek word is semeion. Logos implies the reasoning mind behind the utterance, the sign, the message. We get the word logic from logos, so I hope you see the connection I'm making. So Jesus Christ is the incarnation of divine reason. He manifests in the flesh the rationality of God. And this is not cold logic, an impersonal reason, but we experience it as the peace of God that calms the soul to proper understanding of our common fallen state, our universal need as human beings for reconciliation in God through Christ, that calms us enough to show us what to do in the present crisis. When we recall to ourselves his presence in our lives, when we call upon him to calm the inner turmoil, we are asking for reason to take the helm of our ship, grasp the tiller of our little boat, to bring a halt to the panic and put our minds and souls back on course. That's not always easy to do. It's something we learn from our Lord, sitting patiently at his feet, listening to his words, following his example. To return to this privileging of emotion over reason, we need to understand where this is coming from, the ideological capture of our elites in, well, the cultural industries, in the judiciary, in corporate business, in government, academia, all the heights of our society, captured by what you might call woke ideology, informed by something called critical race theory. A very important idea in critical race theory, or CRT, is the concept of lived experience. Now, it's important to know that CRT started as a school of thought in the study of Western legal systems more than, now we're going on about more than almost 3 decades ago. And it rightly saw that many are disadvantaged in our law courts. So, for example, someone who grows up in a North American city in poverty, in a crime-ridden district, with physical, emotional, sexual abuse in the home, with an absent father, a drug-addicted mother, etc., there is good reason to evaluate the criminal activity of such a person differently from what we refer to as a white-collar criminal. That lived experience of deprivation, ignorance, and violence needs to be understood and factored into what we're going to do with the offender. So it's important to hear what he has to say about his life. When you take that concept, however, and translate it into analyses of groups and communities and the dynamic between them, it begins to become a problem in itself. It's a tool that initially looks promising, but is not suited to the job. Lived experience is inherently subjective. It's one point of view among many others. There's also something called objective reality. And reality is very complex, and it's impossible to know completely. We need humility when we dare to make pronouncements about what really happened in history. Most of history, most of life does not fit into the narrative we see being propagated today, that history is simply a cycle of oppression and violence, victimization and cruelty. We see this when those involved in residential schools are not too subtly compared to concentration camp guards, when the improvised cemeteries at the schools, created because the government would not pay to send home the bodies of children who had died of tuberculosis, scarlet fever, and any other number of common diseases of that era. Their teachers, many of whom lived in poverty themselves, did the best they could, gave them the dignity of burial and likely a simple wooden marker that has long since vanished. It is slanderous to call these places mass graves, as if they were a pit dug after a massacre. These things do not help us heal and reconcile over what is acknowledged and truly a tragedy of the misbegotten policy of compulsory residential schools for Indigenous children. But you know, there is a perverse emotional satisfaction to be found in characterizing history this way. And of course, when one puts oneself on the side of the innocents. What is worrying is that aside from this very serious and substantial issue of the schools, we see lived experience being brought to bear in such a way as to magnify the trivial and create ever more irritation among the many communities and groups that must coexist for our Canadian society to function, let alone flourish. The popular expression of the lived experience concept comes in something that's known as triggering. People becoming upset when they see a sign, a statue, a flag, whatever, based on their identity being somehow threatened by its presence. The emotional upset becomes the basis for banning whatever it is that has offended. In the meantime, those who are not offended, who look at that sign, symbol, statue, whatever, they're not offended by it, but perhaps they have some sense of attachment to it. They are now offended by what looks like an arbitrary attack upon their heritage, their beliefs. But in this instance, their lived experience doesn't count. It all becomes very socially divisive. As a church, as Christians, we must refuse to play this game, to be contestants in the claim to greater victimhood, or conversely, deniers of humanity's tragic history. We must be champions of Christ's reconciliation through forgiveness and healing, and bringing to the world a humility that acknowledges that we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We see in today's gospel passage the precarious state of the Jesus movement. I call it the Jesus movement because during the time of Jesus' ministry on earth, we really can't talk about there being a church, any kind of institution that even remotely resembles the ancient church, let alone what we have today. Simply, there was Jesus and his followers. And there was an emerging leadership that we know, certainly from today's gospel passage, that was not ready to lead. There was then a heavy psychological and spiritual dependence on Jesus being physically present to his followers. Without him at the head of the parade, as it were, this movement would dissolve into a rabble, disperse in confusion. And that's pretty much what the authorities in Jerusalem, both the Romans and those of the temple, counted on when it came time to deal with the troublesome carpenter from Nazareth and his disciples, who were growing in numbers to a worrying degree. Cut off the head, and the body will die instantly. They believed that to be the case, but so too did the disciples. Jesus, falling asleep in the midst of the crisis at sea, had them despairing. It's an indication of the shallowness of their faith, the incomplete understanding they have of the gospel. It's reflective of basic human psychology that, we find comfort in groups. We like to have lots of people who share with us a common identity, a set of beliefs. And we like strong leadership, especially in a crisis. Yet as Christians, because our community is spiritual as well as material, that our communion through Christ transcends space and time, we have no particular need of a mob chanting slogans and shaking fists to be resolved in our beliefs. Think about the lonely martyrs in the Roman arena, cast amidst wild beasts or stood upon scaffolds for public executions for nothing more than their faith. The mob in the stand shouting insults, heckling, taunting, just like the crowd that gathered along the way to Golgotha. We have that great cloud of witnesses ever above us, angels attending us with silent words of encouragement. We don't need commercial brands to sport our colors, multinational corporations to pander to us with hollow pledges of allegiance to our creed. I don't need the NBA to defend Christ the way they have rationalized the crimes of the communist leadership in China, or some late-night comedian on television to parrot church doctrine as they do the tenets of political correctness and then mock anyone who disagrees. We have all that we need. Christ, our captain, is ever present. There he sits enthroned in the tabernacle. And in our communion, both through the Blessed Sacrament, in our constant prayer, he enters into us in a very real way, so as to make a home in us, to be always present and ever awake.